A very troubling Foreign Intelligence Service (SVR) urgent action bulletin circulating in the Kremlin today states that President Donald Trump has convened all of his top national security officers for an emergency meeting at his secure Camp David military protected complex after his receiving firm, conclusive evidence that a leftist communist American terror organization named Antifa is training several hundreds of its forces in Venezuela, and who are the paramilitary wing of the Democratic Party and whose stated goal is the violent overthrow of the United States government. According to this bulletin, on 1st of August, Colombia's National Intelligence Directorate, DNI, sent out a critical crisis advisory to all of the world's top intelligence agencies, including the SVR, detailing a strategic network their counterintelligence operatives had discovered that was funneling hundreds of American Antifa terrorists into Venezuela, and whom once they reached this South American nation, were then, in turn, assigned to various paramilitary collectivos where they received political, weapons, bomb-making and counterinsurgency training prior to their returning to the United States. The Venezuelan collectivo paramilitaries, this bulletin explains, is a nationwide communistic organization of neighborhood collectives established by that nation's regime to protect it against overthrow, and who are all heavily armed by their regime and that Human Rights Watch has described as being armed gangs who use violence with impunity and who harass political opponents of the Venezuelan government. Upon President Trump receiving this vital information, this bulletin continues, he immediately dispatched his Vice President, Mike Pence, to Colombia to verify its conclusions, with his further, on 9th of August, ordering a NATO request for pricing, RFP, titled Development of NATO Military Operations and Urban Environment Concept that calls for the training of these military forces in how to fight in big cities with dense, interconnected populations and Trump, also, on 11th of August, threatening Venezuela with military force by his stating, "We have many options for Venezuela including a possible military option if necessary. We have troops all over the world in places that are very, very far away. Venezuela is not very far away." As to why President Trump threatened to use military force against Venezuela on 11th of August, this bulletin explains, was due to Colombia's DNI noting in their critical crisis advisory that Antifa terrorist captains returning to the United States were covertly designating themselves to their other terror forces in their planned mob actions by their wearing of t-shirts with emblazoned with the words Militias Antifascistas and that Trump's Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, also on 11th of August, had just notified him were gathering in mass in Charlottesville, Virginia. As to how these Antifa terrorists are being funneled into Venezuela to begin their terror training in that nation's communist collectivos, this bulletin explains, is via a clandestine network established by the American militant group Refuse Fascism, funded in part by George Soros, who pays for students associated with the University of California, Berkeley to travel to that South American nation, and whose university officials are most assuredly knowledgeable about this terrorist activity as evidenced by its current chancellor, Carol Christ, urgently requesting the immediate installation of $9,000 security door to protect her, and former chancellor, Nicholas Sturks, who just left his office on 1st of June, also, having had built a $700,000 security fence around his home. To how great a threat these Antifa terrorists actually are to the United States, this bulletin notes, the SVR has rated as extremely and as evidenced by one of their heroes, named Emily Rose Nauert, warning the New York Times this past week, "You need violence in order to protect non-violence. That's what's very obviously necessary right now. It's full-on war." Following through on their full-on war threat, this bulletin continues, Antifa terrorists have spread throughout the United States in order to cause chaos and division, with one of their terror leaders, who goes by the pseudonym Tony Hooligan, vowing to overthrow the United States and saying even if it means an escalation into gunfights, and whose terrorist forces have begun toppling historic statues like their communist ancestors throughout the world did before them, and who are now using another communistic tactic by nearly 300 of them lining up to be arrested for their actions and their belief that their numbers will overwhelm the court systems resulting in their criminal charges being dropped. Antifa terrorists in America this past week too. This bulletin notes, have even spread to the nation's heartland, where an Antifa communist mob attacked the main government building of Hennepin County in Minnesota, took down and burned the American flag that was flying there, then erected their own Antifa flag for everyone to see how much power they had. Most dangerously, though, about these Antifa communists, this bulletin warns, are there, also, being supported by the U.S. leftist propaganda fake news establishment media who claim these terrorists' violence is preserving the fabric of America, but with these same anti-Trump elite media fake news journalists failing to tell the American people how these terrorists are even now violently attacking the media too, and as evidenced by these Antifa terrorists brutally attacking a local news reporter in Charlottesville, Virginia, this past week. After Antifa terrorists left that local CBS 6 news reporter in Charlottesville bloody and concussed, this bulletin continues, they claimed it was his fault because they had demanded that journalists stop doing their jobs because they didn't have consent to document what was happening, and accused the news gatherers they assaulted of perpetuating a rape culture with an Antifa leader, going by the pseudonym of Seven Hills, stating to the media, "We do not fear you. You will not deter us. WHO protects US. We protect US." And who, when requested to state their issues to the public, viciously replied, "CBS 6 has tried to contact us for an interview." Our response? Fuck no. Not just the US fake news leftist media are protecting these Antifa communist terrorists either, this bulletin explains, but so too are many of America's most elite university professors, such as George Sikari Ilomar, a professor at Drexel University in Philadelphia, who says he supports Antifa for their direct actions of violence made outside of any government structure. Rather than be swayed by thoughts and opinions of those American university professors supporting and glorifying these Antifa communists, however, this bulletin continues, that nation would be better served by those in power listening to the highly esteemed MIT professor, and the father of modern linguistics, Noam Chomsky, who is now warning that these Antifa terrorists are a gift to the right as they are feeding the very fire they seek to extinguish. With the rightist forces in America being led by President Trump, this bulletin further notes, Noam Chomsky's words of warning have been proved true, as 68% of Trump's Republican Party voters said in a new CBS News poll that they supported their presidents blaming Antifa communists for being half of the deadly violence occurring in Charlottesville last week, but that the other peoples in America aren't allowed to know about. As the leftist forces in America continue to cheer to apparent successes of these Antifa communists against President Trump, though, this bulletin says, emboldened Democratic Party leaders have escalated their battles too, and as exampled by Democratic Party Missouri Senator Maria Chappelle proclaiming to her leftist supporters yesterday, "I hope Trump is assassinated," and Democratic Party U.S. Congressman Steve Cohen, also yesterday, saying that he will introduce articles of impeachment against Trump based on this president's defense of white supremacists. This bulletin further notes that even from the globalist wing of his own Republican Party is President Trump taking fire too, and as exampled by Republican Party U.S. Senator Bob Corker saying yesterday about Trump, "I do think that there do need to be radical changes. He has not demonstrated that he understands the character of this nation. Our nation is going to go through great peril." FVR intelligence analysts writing in this report, however, dismiss most of Senator Corker's words because, they state, if there is anyone who understands the character of America more than anyone else, it's President Trump, and who, in his ascent to the U.S. presidency, accomplished a feat no one else dared think could be done by his defeating of not only his Republican Party opponents, but the entire Bush family regime, the even more powerful Clinton family regime, and Obama's Democratic Party too. Agreeing, however, with Senator Corker, this bulletin continues, these same FVR intelligence analysts warn that his saying that our nation is going to go through great peril will soon prove all too true, and that any historian can attest to as the last time the Democratic Party faced a Republican Party president that threatened to destroy their elite and privileged way of life. The then pro-slavery Democratic Party took all of the states they controlled, seceded from the United States, created an 1861 paramilitary version of Antifa they called the Confederate Army, and then promptly started a civil war they eventually lost, but at the cost of up to 850,000 lives. If the Antifa communist terrorists and their fake news propagandist media supporters, though, really wanted to remain true to their stated aim and goals of totally erasing from America's historical memory everything related to racism, this bulletin says, instead of their calling for the destruction of all Confederate Civil War monuments, Confederate statues today, book burnings tomorrow, the blowing up of Mount Rushmore, and the eradication of everything having to do with their nation's founding fathers because most of them were slave owners, they should first destroy the very head of the snake of racism called the Democratic Party, whom, they conveniently forget, defended slavery, started the Civil War, created Jim Crow laws, founded the KKK, and fought against every major civil rights act in U.S. history. This bulletin concludes by noting, of course, that no such thing will happen as these Antifa communists and their fake news propagandist media supporters cannot even acknowledge the simplest fact that the less racist America gets, the more Republican it becomes, as most Americans, especially in the South, who know history, remember the vile racist crimes of these Democratic Party monsters, and who, also, know that their President Trump hasn't forgotten this truth either.